The lasagna I'd made was sitting in the oven, staying warm, and I was on the couch, half watching a home renovation show when my phone buzzed. I figured it was my husband texting to say he'd be late again. He was always late on Thursdays. It wasn't him. It was a number I didn't recognize, a 416 area code, but not saved in my contacts. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me pick up. Is this Nora? Nora Calloway? A woman's voice, professional, calm in that specific way that emergency workers are trained to be calm. Yes, that's me. This is St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto. I'm calling regarding your husband, Elliot Calloway. He was brought in by ambulance about 40 minutes ago. We need you to come in as soon as possible. My first thought was the highway. He'd driven to a client dinner in Mississauga. Black ice had been a problem all week. I grabbed my coat off the hook by the door without even turning off the oven. I was already in the car, backing down the driveway, when I realized I hadn't asked what happened to him. I called back from the car. The nurse who answered was gentle, careful with her words in a way that should have told me everything. She said the doctor would speak with me when I arrived. She said to drive safely. I drove anything but safely. The emergency department at St. Mike's is never quiet, but when I pushed through the sliding doors at 9:47 on a Thursday night, the chaos around me felt muffled, like I was hearing everything through water. A triage nurse directed me to a family consultation room, a small beige box of a room with 4 chairs and a box of Kleenex on the table, the kind of room that exists for one purpose only. My mother-in-law was already there. She was sitting in the chair closest to the door, her coat still on, her purse clutched in both hands in her lap. My father-in-law sat beside her. My husband's younger brother, Colin, was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. I stopped in the doorway. "How are you here already?" I asked. They lived in Barrie. It was a 90-minute drive on a good day, longer in winter. My mother-in-law looked up at me and her face did something complicated that I couldn't read. "We came as soon as we heard," she said. I didn't ask who called them. I should have. I was too focused on the fact that a doctor hadn't come yet, and that the room existed, and that everyone was sitting down, and that nobody was crying yet, but the air felt like the moment before. The doctor came in 4 minutes later, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She introduced herself and then she sat down, which doctors only do when the news requires sitting down to receive. Elliot had had a cardiac event. Sudden, massive. They had worked on him for 31 minutes. They were very sorry. My mother-in-law made a sound I'd never heard a human being make before. I sat completely still. He was 38 years old. He went to the gym 3 times a week. He'd had a physical in September, and his doctor had said he was in excellent shape. Where was he? I heard myself ask. Where was he when it happened? The doctor glanced at her clipboard, then at me, then at my in-laws. The paramedics were called to a residence on Broadview Avenue, she said carefully. A woman at the address made the 911 call. Broadview Avenue. Elliot had told me he was having dinner in Mississauga with a client named Doug. There is no Doug who lives on Broadview Avenue. The next hour is still blurry to me. I remember someone handing me a cup of tea that I never drank. I remember Colin stepping out to make phone calls. I remember my father-in-law asking whether Elliot had updated his life insurance beneficiary after we'd refinanced the house 2 years ago. And I remember thinking that was a very strange question for a man to ask about his son in the same hour his son had just died. A police officer came and spoke to me briefly. Standard procedure, he said, when someone dies outside a medical facility. He was kind. He told me the woman who had called 911 had given a statement and then left the scene before officers arrived, which struck me as odd, but I was too hollowed out to press him on it. My mother-in-law asked me about the funeral arrangements before we left the hospital. I looked at her. "He's been gone for 2 hours," I said. "These things take planning, Nora. Elliot would have wanted something dignified." She paused. "Do you have your card with you? Your visa? We'll need a deposit for the funeral home." And that specific moment was the one that cleared my head completely. Not the news of his death, not the discovery that he died somewhere he had no business being. It was my mother-in-law asking for my credit card in a hospital waiting room with Elliot's body still warm down the hall. I said I'd be in touch, and I walked out to the parking lot alone, and I sat in my car for a long time in the dark. I need to back up so any of this makes sense. When Elliot and I got married 6 years ago, I was 28 and working as a project manager at a mid-sized construction firm downtown. I wasn't rich, but I was stable, good salary, solid benefits, a condo I'd bought on my own at 25 in what was then still a buyable neighborhood in the East End. Elliot was a financial advisor, charming and confident, with a client base he was always on the verge of dramatically expanding. He had big ideas. He just also had, as I slowly came to understand, a complicated relationship with follow-through. Within a year of our wedding, we'd sold my condo and bought a house in Leslieville. The mortgage was in both our names, but I was carrying the larger share of it. My income was more consistent. Elliot's practice had good months and bad months. I told myself that was normal for self-employment. I told myself a lot of things. His parents were a fixture. They were lovely people in small doses and overwhelming people in large ones. And they had a habit of treating Elliot's money, which was really our money, which was really mostly my money, as a family resource. There was always something. A car repair. A dental bill my father-in-law's insurance didn't cover. A week in Florida they needed help with because their savings just weren't where they needed to be. I paid for these things without complaint because Elliot asked me to, and because I loved him, and because I believed in the idea of family. His brother Colin had been between jobs for the better part of 3 years. I had quietly paid 3 months of his rent at a point when his landlord was threatening to evict him. I had never told anyone I did that. I had not expected to be repaid, but I had not expected to be standing in a hospital asking myself how my mother-in-law had beaten me here either. Things don't always turn out the way you expect. The days after Elliot's death were a particular kind of horrible that I don't have adequate words for. Grief is strange when it's tangled up with betrayal. I was mourning someone I thought I knew while simultaneously understanding, with increasing clarity, that I had not known him at all. The woman on Broadview Avenue had been in his life for at least 2 years. I found this out not from Elliot, obviously, and not from his family, but from a mutual friend who had known and said nothing, and from Elliot's email account, which I accessed because I needed to find the password to our joint investment account, and found rather more than I bargained for. Her name was in those emails. I won't use it here. What I'll say is that she had, at some point in those 2 years, received a necklace from a boutique on Queen Street that I had admired once and that Elliot had said was too expensive for no occasion. He had bought it for her 2 weeks later. I know this because I found the receipt in a folder in his email labeled with breathtaking boldness, "Receipts." The funeral was held 10 days after he died. I paid for it. I paid for it because he was my husband and because in Canada, the surviving spouse bears legal responsibility for reasonable funeral expenses, and because it was the right thing to do even when nothing else was. It was a simple service, not the elaborate affair my mother-in-law had envisioned, but dignified as she'd said Elliot would have wanted. I arranged it with a funeral home on the Danforth, and I paid the deposit with my own credit card, and I sat in the front row and I accepted condolences from people, some of whom, I realized later, had probably known things I hadn't. The day after the funeral, my mother-in-law called and asked me what I was planning to do about the house situation. "There is no house situation," I said. "The house is mine." A pause. "It was in both your names, Nora." "Yes. And now Elliot is gone, and with right of survivorship, it passes entirely to me. I had a lawyer confirm this 2 days ago. I had, in fact, called a real estate lawyer the morning after Elliot died, before I had even called most of our friends. I am not proud of how quickly my brain went there, but I am also not ashamed of it." Another pause, longer. "We thought Elliot always said that if anything happened to him, Elliot didn't have a will, I said. I checked. His lawyer confirmed it. In Canada, dying intestate when you're married with no children means your spouse inherits everything. Elliot's family was entitled to nothing, not legally, not under the law of Ontario, not under any document he had ever signed. Whatever he had told them, whatever promises he had made them, they had no claim. My mother-in-law said this felt very cold of me. I said I understood that it felt that way. Then I said goodbye and hung up. 3 weeks after the funeral, a woman I didn't know sent me a message on Facebook. No profile picture, account created 2 weeks prior. The message said she believed she was entitled to a portion of Elliot's estate given the nature of their relationship and the investments he had made on her behalf, and that she had spoken to a lawyer who agreed she had grounds to pursue a claim. I read this message 3 times. Then I forwarded it to my own lawyer, who told me, with barely contained amusement, that a common law partner cannot make a claim against a married spouse's estate in Ontario unless there was financial interdependence and cohabitation, and that the woman in question would need to prove Elliot had supported her, which would be difficult since I was the one who had actually supported Elliot. I did not respond to her message. My lawyer sent her lawyer a letter. I never heard from her again. What I did in the months after Elliot died is less dramatic than you might expect and more purposeful than anyone around me seemed comfortable with. I listed the house in March when the spring market was just starting to move. My real estate agent told me the East End had held its value remarkably well and that I should expect strong interest. She was right. We had 11 offers. I accepted one that came in $42,000 over asking, firm, with a 60-day close. I had already found an apartment, a 2-bedroom in a converted Victorian near Riverdale Park, the kind of place I'd always wanted to live when I was single and never quite got around to finding. I signed the lease on a Tuesday. I moved in on a Friday with the help of 2 of my friends and a rented cargo van. The apartment had good light. That sounds like a small thing. It wasn't. I called my mother-in-law to let her know about the house sale. I told her and my father-in-law that I was sorry for their loss and that I was moving forward with my own life. I said it kindly. I meant it kindly. I had spent a lot of time in the preceding months being angry, and I had made a deliberate choice to exit that particular room and close the door behind me. She cried. She told me I was abandoning them. She said Elliot would be devastated. I thought Elliot did not leave me a great deal of moral authority to invoke. I said I hoped they would be okay. I said goodbye. Colin sent me a long email 6 weeks after I moved. He wanted me to know that the family felt I had acted selfishly and without compassion, that I had used Elliot's death to take advantage of a situation to benefit myself, and that he hoped I would reconsider my position and do something for his parents, who were struggling. I sat with that email for 2 days. Then I wrote back. I told him that I'd paid for his rent for 3 months in 2021, something I had never told Elliot or anyone else. I told him that I had paid for his parents' Florida trip in 2022 and their car repairs in 2022 and their car repairs in 2023. I told him that for 6 years I had contributed quietly and consistently to a family that was not my own because I believed that was what people who love each other do. I told him that I had found out my husband had been conducting a long-term affair, had been lying to me for years, had made promises to people he had no right to make, and had died before he could be held accountable for any of it. I told him I wished his parents well. I told him I was done. I never received a reply. There is a thing that happens to you after an experience like this, a gradual, quiet reassembly of yourself. That is nothing like the dramatic transformations in movies. Nobody plays uplifting music. You just wake up one morning and realize you've been sleeping through the night without dreaming and that you made yourself dinner last night without it feeling like a performance of normalcy. And that when you walked home from the grocery store, you noticed the cherry blossoms starting on the trees along Broadview. Not Broadview Avenue, a different Broadview, the one in my neighborhood now. And you stood there for a minute just looking at them. That's what it's like. I got a promotion at work in October. My firm had a large infrastructure project coming through, and they needed someone who could manage the client relationship end to end. My director said she'd been considering me for the role for a while and that the timing finally worked out. I said yes without hesitating. I got a dog. She's a 3-year-old beagle mix I adopted from a rescue in Etobicoke, and she is completely unimpressed by every difficulty I've ever experienced, which I find enormously comforting. I have been to therapy, which is unremarkable to say in 2026, but which I mention because it has helped me understand something I kept getting stuck on: the question of whether I was wrong to feel the way I feel. Not angry, the anger made sense, but the particular guilt of not feeling more grief, of discovering in the weeks after Elliot died that some significant portion of what I had believed to be love was actually loyalty to a story I'd been telling myself. My therapist said that what I'd lost was not just Elliot, but the marriage I'd thought I had, and that those were two separate losses that could be grieved separately. I've been trying to do that. Some days it's easier than others. My apartment lease is up for renewal next month. I've been thinking about whether to renew or look for something else. Maybe something outside the city eventually. There's a part of me that keeps looking at properties in Prince Edward County in that dreamy and unrealistic way that people who work full-time in Toronto do. I've told exactly 2 friends about this plan. One of them laughed. The other said I should just do it. I don't know what I'll do. What I know is that when I come home at the end of the day now, the apartment is exactly as I left it. The beagle is ecstatic to see me in the unqualified, uncomplicated way that dogs are. There is no one sitting across from me at the dinner table who is somewhere else in their head. There is no conversation I am dreading having, no question I am afraid to ask. There is just the apartment and the dog and the good light through the west-facing windows in the afternoon, and some evenings that is more than enough. I am 33 years old. I own a business casual blazer that I got dry cleaned last week. I have a good job and a functional RRSP and a lease on an apartment that I chose entirely by myself. And sometimes on the walk home along my Broadview, I stand under the cherry blossoms and I think, I'm going to be okay. Not in the way I planned, not with the life I thought I was building, but okay. Genuinely, surprisingly, stubbornly okay. I still think about the moment the doctor sat down, not what she said. I barely remember the exact words. I think about the fact that I noticed her sit down, and that some part of my brain, even in that moment, understood what it meant. That's the thing nobody tells you about crisis. The mind keeps working even when the heart is coming apart at the seams. For a long time after Elliot died, I asked myself whether I had missed something, whether there were signs I'd chosen not to see, questions I'd chosen not to ask. There were, of course. There always are, in hindsight. But I've come to understand that the more useful question isn't what I missed, it's what I do with the clarity I have now. Elliot made choices. His family made choices. Every person in this story made choices, and those choices had consequences that rippled outward in ways none of them fully anticipated. His mother asked for my credit card in a hospital waiting room and lost any claim to my generosity. Colin sent me an email accusing me of selfishness and lost the right to my silence about the rent I'd quietly paid for 3 months. The woman on Broadview sent me a legal threat with no legal basis and was answered by a letter from my lawyer and never heard from again. None of these outcomes were punishments I designed. They were simply the natural result of how each person chose to behave. I think about that when I'm tempted to be bitter. The bitterness doesn't serve me. What serves me is being clear-eyed about what happened, about what I'm responsible for, about what I'm not. What I'm responsible for, I stayed in a marriage longer than the evidence warranted because I wanted the story I was telling myself to be true. That's on me, and I've spent time with a therapist working through what that means. Being honest about your own patterns, really honest, not the flattering kind, is harder than being angry at someone else. It's also more useful. What I'm not responsible for, Elliot's choices, his family's entitlement, the years of quiet misdirection. You can be a decent person and still end up in a situation that wasn't decent. Those two things coexist. What I've learned, and this took longer than I'd like to admit, is that intelligence without integrity is just cleverness, and cleverness can be used for almost anything. Elliot was clever. He managed his double life for at least 2 years without my catching on. But being clever isn't the same as being good, and it certainly isn't the same as being strong. Real strength, I've come to think, is what you do when you've been genuinely knocked down and the easier path would be to collapse. I could have spiraled. I could have let the grief and the humiliation and the betrayal calcify into something that poisoned the next 10 years. Instead, I called a lawyer, listed the house, signed a lease on an apartment with good light, and adopted a beagle who has never once questioned my judgment. That's not a small thing. It's actually the whole thing. I am 33. I have a functional RRSP and a job I'm good at and a life that is entirely uncomplicatedly mine. I built that out of the wreckage of something that wasn't working, and I built it by being honest and clear-headed and stubborn enough to keep going on the days when going felt impossible. That, I think, is all any of us can really do.